Welcome to another deep dive. Today we'll be tackling Islamic legal theory and epistemology.
Ooh, sounds intense.
It is, but fascinating too. Trust me.
I'm ready. Lay it on me.
Okay, so we're exploring how medieval Islamic scholars wrestled with the limits of logic and reason, especially when it comes to understanding the world around us.
I can already see how that would be tricky.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. You've got these brilliant minds, right?
Right.
Trying to make ancient Greek logic jive with the Quran and their legal system.
Oh, wow. Yeah, talk about a culture clash.
Exactly. And the source material you gave me really gets into the weeds.
Awesome.
Right away, it throws us into this whole concept of circularity.
Circularity.
Yeah, in Islamic legal reasoning.
Okay.
There are like three types.
Yeah.
Universal, legal, and arithmetical. I got to admit, when I first saw circular reasoning, I thought, wait, isn't that a logical fallacy?
Yeah, I can see why you'd think that.
But it's not that simple, is it?
Not really. It all boils down to how that circularity functions, you know what I mean? Like imagine you're trying to prove something exists, like let's call it P.
Okay, P exists.
But in order to prove P, you have to assume that Q is true.
All right, so P needs Q.
But to prove Q, you have to assume P is true.
So they're both relying on each other.
Yeah, like a dog chasing its tail.
Uh-huh, I get it.
That's what's called universal circularity.
Universal circularity.
It's generally a no-go in logic, you know.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
That's like saying this book is reliable because it says it's reliable.
Exactly. Not very convincing.
Not at all.
Yeah.
But the source material mentions some types of circularity that are actually considered valid.
Oh, interesting.
In Islamic legal reasoning.
Yeah. So what are those?
Well, one example is conjunctive circularity.
Conjunctive circularity. Oh.
This is where two concepts are just inherently linked, you know, like fatherhood and sonship.
Okay. Yeah.
One can't exist without the other.
Right. Right.
So there's like a natural circularity there.
Okay.
But the key is that these concepts are like mutually dependent, not just randomly linked.
I see. I see.
So accepting some forms of circular reasoning but rejecting others, that's got to have some pretty major implications for how these scholars approach knowledge, right?
Oh, absolutely.
And built their legal system, too.
Yeah, definitely.
But the real star of the show here, in this deep dive, seems to be Ibn Taymiyya.
Ibn Taymiyya, okay.
Now, he didn't just buy everything the logicians were selling, right?
Not quite. He agreed that logical arguments like syllogisms could be valid, like in their structure.
Okay.
But he was pretty skeptical about whether they could actually reveal truths about the real world.
Wait, so you're saying you can have a perfectly logical argument that's totally detached from reality?
That's exactly what he was getting at.
Wow. What was his reasoning there?
Well, Ibn Taymiyya argued that a syllogism, even if it's perfectly structured, doesn't guarantee that you actually know it exists in the world.
Huh.
He was really critical of how the logicians defined what they called apodictic knowledge.
Apodictic meaning?
Absolutely certain knowledge.
Okay, got it.
They relied really heavily on three sources: sensory data, inner senses, and experience. And Ibn Taymiyya systematically kind of dismantled each of those.
Okay, let's break that down. What was wrong with relying on our senses, according to him?
He argued that our senses are just limited, you know?
Okay.
We can't experience everything in the universe, so how can we make these universal statements based on just our limited sensory data?
Ah, so we can't observe every single instance of something.
Right.
So how can we be absolutely certain about a general rule based only on what we've experienced?
Exactly.
That makes sense. Did he give any specific examples?
He did. He used the example of fire burning.
Okay, yeah, fire burns.
We observe that fire typically burns things,
Sure.
but there was this belief at the time that this salamander stone, a mythical substance,
Salamander stone.
could withstand fire.
Okay.
Now, whether or not it actually existed isn't really the point.
Right.
It's that there could always be exceptions to what we think are universal truths based on our senses.
So even our most basic observations might not be giving us the full picture.
Exactly.
That's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
It is, yeah.
What about the inner senses then? How did he challenge that one?
So he argued that inner senses, like feelings of pain or joy, are subjective, you know, unique to each person.
Right.
Like, my pain is different from your pain.
Of course.
So you can't build universal truths on something so personal and variable.
So inner senses are too individualized, too specific to each person to be the basis of this absolute knowledge.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about experience in general? Didn't the logicians think experience was a reliable source of knowledge?
They did, but Ibn Taymiyya pointed out that experience is always limited to specific instances. You can't experience all fire, for instance.
Right, only specific fires.
Yeah, only particular fires.
Okay.
So how can you make a definitive statement about something you've only experienced in a limited way?
Wow, he's really picking apart all these sources of knowledge.
He is.
It seems like he's building towards something here.
Yeah.
If logic alone isn't enough, and our senses and inner feelings and even experiences are limited,
Right.
then what are we supposed to rely on to understand the world?
That's the million-dollar question, and it leads us right to the heart of Ibn Taymiyya's critique.
Okay, I'm ready.
He's not saying we should abandon logic entirely,
Gotcha.
but rather that we need more tools in our toolkit, so to speak. He believed that analogy and observation play a really crucial role in getting true knowledge about the world.
So he's pushing for a more holistic approach to knowledge.
Yes.
One that goes beyond just sitting around thinking things through.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
Okay, this is where things start to get really interesting. And we'll dive into all of that in the next part of our deep dive.
Sounds good. Picking up where we left off, Ibn Taymiyya really dives into the limits of logic, especially when it comes to, proving something definitively.
Okay.
He points out that even syllogisms, which were the gold standard of proof for the logicians,
Right.
actually rely on something they kind of dismissed. Analogy.
Wait, so the structure of a syllogism,
Yeah.
which is all about logic and deduction, right?
Right.
Depends on analogy.
That's what he's saying.
That seems kind of ironic. How does he explain that?
Well, let's take a classic example.
Okay.
All men are mortal.
Okay.
Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal.
Right. Classic syllogism.
Seems straightforward, but Ibn Taymiyya would be like, hold on. How do you know that all men are mortal? Have you, witnessed the death of every single man who ever lived?
Of course not. I mean, I'm just assuming that because I've seen people die. And I know they were human, that all humans must die too.
Exactly. You're using analogy. You're observing a pattern in a limited set of cases and then extending that pattern to a broader category.
Right.
And Ibn Taymiyya argued that this process of analogy is fundamental to how we build knowledge about the world, even when we're using what seems like pure logic.
So he's not saying that analogy is a bad thing. He's just saying it's kind of woven into how we reason.
Yeah, exactly.
Even in these super logical syllogisms.
Exactly.
I see why he pushed back against this idea.
Yeah.
That logic alone can give us this absolute certainty.
Yeah, because if the foundation of our logical arguments, those initial premises, are based on analogy, which itself involves a degree of uncertainty,
right,
then the conclusions we draw can never be absolutely certain either.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's like building a house on a foundation of sand.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how strong the structure is, it's still vulnerable.
Right.
But this raises a big question for me.
Okay.
If we can't achieve absolute certainty through logic or observation,
right,
what kind of knowledge can we actually attain?
That's the question, isn't it?
It is.
That's a question that philosophers have been wrestling with for centuries. Ibn Taymiyya believed that while we may not be able to achieve this, unshakable certainty about the world, we can still arrive at, reliable, practical knowledge through a combination of approaches.
Okay.
He emphasized seeking knowledge from multiple sources, including revelation, tradition, personal experience, and of course, reason and observation.
Of course.
The key is to constantly test and refine our understanding by comparing it to the world around us.
So it's not about clinging to this rigid certainty, but about being open to new information.
Right.
And being willing to kind of adjust our understanding as we learn more.
Exactly.
That sounds a lot like the scientific method.
There are definitely parallels there.
Yeah.
Ibn Taymiyya believed that knowledge is an ongoing journey, not a final destination.
I like that.
Yeah. And he emphasized the importance of intellectual humility.
Okay.
Acknowledging that we don't have all the answers.
Yeah.
And being open to learning from others.
Right.
And from our own experiences.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
From circular reasoning to the limits of logic, the importance of analogy and observation.
Right.
But I'm curious how all of this connects back to Ibn Taymiyya's own context, Islamic law and practice.
Yeah.
He was more than just a philosopher, right?
Absolutely. He was deeply engaged in applying these epistemological ideas, these theories of knowledge, to like the interpretation and practice of Islam. And that's where things get really interesting, because his views were often quite controversial.
Ooh, controversy. I love it.
Yes.
Let's dive into that in the next part of our deep dive.
Let's do it.
Okay, so we're back, ready to unpack this whole controversial side of Ibn Taymiyya.
I'm ready when you are.
So we've covered his critique of logic, emphasis on analogy and observation, but how did all this high-level thinking actually play out in his understanding of Islamic law?
Well, for Ibn Taymiyya, knowledge wasn't just some abstract concept, you know?
Okay.
It had to be lived, put into action, especially when it came to Islamic principles.
So it's not enough to just like intellectually get the ideas of Islam. You actually got to do something with it.
Exactly.
Okay.
He was a big believer in the connection between knowing and doing. You know, he argued that truly understanding Islamic law meant not only knowing the texts, like the Quran and Hadith, but also being able to apply those teachings to real-life situations.
That sounds like a pretty tall order.
It is.
Islamic law covers so much ground.
It does.
Everything from prayer and fasting to marriage and inheritance, financial dealings.
It's comprehensive.
How did he think people should go about applying these laws in such diverse situations?
He believed it required a deep understanding of the context, looking at legal precedents and remembering the big picture, the principles of justice and mercy that are at the heart of Islam. You know, it wasn't about just memorizing rules and applying them blindly.
So you need to use your brain, consider the specifics of each case, and make sure your judgments are aligned with the core values of Islam.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay.
He emphasized the importance of ijtihad, which is basically independent legal reasoning.
Okay.
It's about qualified scholars using their knowledge and judgment to interpret and apply Islamic law in a way that's relevant to their time and place.
Okay.
This is where his earlier ideas about analogy and observation really come into play.
Yeah, I was just thinking that. You can't reason in a vacuum.
Nope.
Got to look at real-world situations.
Right.
Compare them to previous cases. Use your powers of deduction to reach a sound judgment.
Exactly. Ibn Taymiyya saw Islamic law as a living tradition, something that needed to be constantly interpreted and adapted to fit new circumstances.
That makes sense.
But, and here's the thing, this got him into some hot water.
Oh, really?
Because he was challenging the more rigid, established legal schools of his time.
Ah, so he was a bit of a rebel in the Islamic scholarship world.
You could say that.
Yeah, that tracks with how much he questioned the status quo when it came to logic and knowledge.
Yeah, he wasn't afraid to go against the grain.
So what was driving him? What were his motivations?
He really believed that Islamic law should be applied in a way that upholds justice and promotes the well-being of the community. And he wasn't afraid to kind of shake things up to make that happen.
Wow. We have gone from the intricacies of circular reasoning to the limits of logic.
Yeah, we have.
To the importance of analogy and observation.
It's all connected.
And finally, how all of that shaped Ibn Taymiyya's understanding of Islamic law.
It's amazing how his thinking connects all these seemingly different areas.
It is. So, you know, we've been talking a lot about this one scholar.
We have.
But his ideas, are they just for Islamic scholars?
No, not at all.
Or do they have something to offer everyone, like me and our listeners out there?
Definitely. They have a lot to offer anyone trying to make sense of the world, especially in our current age of information overload.
That's a great point. So what can we, the everyday folks, learn from Ibn Taymiyya? What's the takeaway for us?
I think his work reminds us to be humble about what we know, to be open to different ways of understanding the world, and to remember that knowledge should lead to action.
Yeah, to actually making a positive difference.
Exactly.
It's easy to get caught up in debates and theories.
It is.
But knowledge is most valuable when it's used to make the world a better place.
I completely agree.
Okay, so as we're wrapping up our deep dive into Ibn Taymiyya's thought, what's that one question we can leave our listeners with? Something to ponder, you know?
How about this? How do you balance logic, experience, and other ways of knowing in your own life?
Ooh, that's a good one.
And how do you translate what you know into positive action?
Those are great questions to think about.
I hope so.
I know I'll be chewing on them as I go about my day.
Me too.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone.
Thanks for having me.